Hi there, my name is Gary Pride, and I just unpackaged a new criminal law. Look at that, it's backwards, isn't it? Criminal law. Law school flashcards. Anyway, this is from Critical Pass, and a first-year law students take criminal law, torts, contracts, and they do an introduction to law. So I thought I'd read these as a way to get myself acclimated with this subject and maybe give my ideas on what I think of it now and probably get a kick out of what I thought things meant in the beginning and then what I learned later about them. So the first card here is an index card. It talks about there's 6 categories: criminal law principles, and I don't know what this is, inchoate offenses. It's INCHOATE. I'll have to look that up and see how that's pronounced. Crimes against the person, crimes against the person continued, I guess here. Crimes against property, crimes against a dwelling, and defenses against those kinds of accusations. So let's get into it and see what the next flashcard is. They're all here in order, so I'm just going to go through them and see what the next one is. Sources of criminal law. There are 3 main sources of criminal law: common law crimes, statutory crimes, and modal penal code rules. Common law crimes is defined as crimes created and enforced by the judiciary in the absence of a statute defining the offense. Generally, there are no federal common law crimes except for in the District of Columbia. Makes sense. Modern trend. Now I wonder if that has anything to do with statutory, because here they just talked about common law crimes, statutory crimes, and modal penal or model penal codes or modal penal codes. Modern trend. Moving away from common law, most states have comprehensive criminal codes that have replaced common law crimes. Most codes state elements of crimes that are often based on common law. Common law defenses to crimes often still apply where statutes do not expressly provide for these defenses. Okay. And the Modern Penal Code, MPC, is a comprehensive body of criminal law. Not a source of law, but instead a scholarly endeavor. The Modern Penal Code, MPC. Alright, so not actually the law, but a scholarly endeavor. Next card is classification of crimes. Several means of classifying crimes are employed by courts and or state statutory schemes. So felonies and misdemeanors. Most states classify crimes by felonies and misdemeanors. Felonies usually applies to all crimes punishable by death or imprisonment exceeding 1 year. Misdemeanors usually applies to all crimes punishable by imprisonment for less than 1 year or a fine only. Malum in se and malum prohibitum. Malum in se is a crime that is inherently evil, either because the criminal intent is an element of the offense or because the crime involves moral turpitude. For example, battery, murder, larceny. Malum prohibitum is a crime that is wrong only because it is prohibited by legislation, e.g. driving over the speed limit, hunting without a license are some examples of that. So those are classifications of crimes, felonies and misdemeanors, and then malum in se and malum prohibitum. Classification of crimes. Elements of the crime. The prosecution is generally required to prove beyond prove below elements of a criminal offense. Some crimes also require proof of certain attendant circumstances. Actus reus, meaning guilty act, a physical act or unlawful omission by the defendant. It says here refer to card 4, so we're going to go into that a little deeper here in a minute. Mens rea, that's a guilty mind, the defendant's state of mind or intent at the time of his act. So these are the elements of the crime. Concurrence, the physical act and the mental state existed at the same time. 4, harmful result and causation. The defendant's act caused a harmful act. Attendant circumstances. Additionally, some crimes require proof of other circumstances without which the act and intent would not be criminal. For example, receipt of stolen property requires that the property received has actually been stolen. So that's the elements of a crime. A little more specific here. Actus reus. See, if I hold this up, it's backwards. Yeah, it doesn't help you at all. Maybe it'll come out different from what I'm seeing on the screen. We'll see. Since this is the first time I've done this. Actus reus is the act required to commit a given crime. A required component of every common law crime, along with mens rea, which was your mental status of what was in your mind. Is what we just went through. State of mind or intent at the time of the act. To satisfy the actus reus requirement, the defendant must perform a voluntary physical act. There must be some voluntary bodily movement by the defendant. Involuntary acts cannot be the basis for criminal liability. For example, no liability for reflexive or compulsive acts or acts done while unconscious or asleep. Now, omission is a failure to act can constitute an actus reus if the defendant had a specific legal duty to act, or 2, the defendant had knowledge of facts giving rise to the duty, and 3, it was reasonably possible for the defendant to perform the duty. Actus reus must be concurrent with mens res. For example, mens res and actus reus must exist simultaneously. Mens rea. Mens rea is the mental element required at the time of the crime, at the time a crime was committed. A required component of every common law crime along with actus reus. Forms of mens rea. General intent. The defendant is aware of his actions and attendant circumstances. For example, awareness of the factors constituting the crime. May be inferred from the act itself. Generally, all crimes require general intent. Specific intent, where the crime requires a specific intent or objective to commit the act. For example, forgery requires an intent to defraud. Card 6 here, it says is going to be a specific intent crime, so that's our next card. Or third, in the mens rea, forms of mens rea, is malice, where the defendant acts with reckless disregard or undertakes an obvious risk from which a harmful result is expected. This can apply to arson and common law murder. Very interesting. Intent. So specific intent crimes is the next card. For a crime requiring specific intent, the defendant must have subjective desire, specific objective, or knowledge to accomplish a prohibited result. Compared to general intent, which requires only that the defendant is aware of his actions and any attendant circumstances. Okay, so we went through that first. So this is more specific. Specific intent crimes and the requisite intent for each. Attempt, intend to complete the crime. Larceny and robbery, intend to permanently deprive victim of his interest in the property taken. Forgery, intent to defraud. False pretenses, intent to defraud. Embezzlement is intent to defraud. Conspiracy, the intent to aid or encourage completion of the crime. Assault, intent to commit battery. Burglary, intent to commit a felony in another's dwelling. First-degree murder, premeditation and or deliberation. Solicitation, the intent to have solicitee commit the solicited crime. So those are the 10 specific intent areas given by Critical Past Law School flashcards. All right, transferred intent doctrine. So under the transferred intent doctrine, the defendant may be held liable if he intends the harm caused, but causes it to a different victim or object than intended. Okay, for example, defendant intends to injure A, commit battery, but accidentally injured B, who steps in front of A. D will be liable for the attempted battery of A and the actual battery of B. Often this applies to homicide, battery, and arson. Defenses and mitigating circumstances may also be transferred. The effect of a transferred intent doctrine. The defendant is usually charged with 2 crimes: an attempt to commit the originally intended crime, and 2, the actual resulting crime. For example, defendant intends to shoot and kill A but kills B. The defendant can be charged with attempted murder of A and the actual murder of B. Accomplice liability. Under the accomplice liability, all parties to the crime can be found guilty of the criminal offense committed. An accomplice equals one who intentionally aids, counsels, or encourages the principal before or during the crime and intends that the principal commit the crime. And liability, an accomplice is liable for the crimes he committed or counseled and other foreseeable crimes the principal commits. For example, A helps B burn down C's house. B does so, and the fire also spreads and burns X's house. A is liable for arson against C and X's houses. Defenses with exceptions to accomplice liability. Withdrawal. D can repudiate his aid or encouragement by doing all that is possible to counteract his prior assistance before the crime occurs or becomes unstoppable. A member of a protected class. Those protected by a criminal statute are not liable as accomplices. For example, minor victims in a statutory rape cases are not liable as accomplices to statutory rape. Parties not provided for in the statute, for example, a purchaser of drugs cannot be an accomplice to the seller. Okay, so that's a little interesting. Members of a protected class, those are protected from criminal statutes, are not liable as accomplices. For example, minor victims in statutory rape cases are not liable as accomplices to statutory rape. Okay, minor victims. The next one here in criminal law is, this is a inchoate, I-N-C-O-H-O-A-T-E offenses. I sure hope I'm getting that right, but I have no idea. An act done with the intent to commit a crime that constitutes an overt or substantial step towards committing the crime, but falls short of completing the crime. Attempt is an incomplete act that would be a crime if completed. Overt act. The defendant must commit an act beyond mere preparation. Defendant must take a substantial step towards committing the target crime. The intent. The defendant must intend to commit a particular crime. D. The defendant lunges at the victim with a knife intending to kill the victim but merely nicks the victim's hand. Defendant is liable for attempted murder. Defenses. Legal impossibility is a defense, but it's rarely used. If D, even completing all acts he intended, would have committed no crime, he cannot be found guilty of attempt. Factual impossibility is not a defense. Not a defense if the substantive crime is incapable of completion due to some physical or factual condition. For example, A sticks his hand in B's purse to take her wallet, but the purse is empty. A is still guilty of attempted larceny. Actual impossibility is not a defense. Okay, that makes sense. You did try, but just because there wasn't any money in there, you're still guilty. Conspiracy. An agreement between two or more people to commit a crime or an objective by criminal means. The elements of this are: 1. An agreement between two or more persons, a meeting of the minds. Express agreement is not required. Express, in my understanding, is written. But I could be wrong. We'll find out as I go through this thing here. Intent to enter into the agreement is an element. Intent to commit the target crime or pursue the unlawful objective. An overt act in furtherance of the target crime. Any slight act will suffice in most states. If A and B agree to burglarize C's house and they buy a ski mask to conceal their faces during the burglary, A and B will be liable for conspiracy to commit burglary. Defenses. Impossibility is still not a defense here. For example, not a defense if it would have been impossible to actually commit the target offense. Withdrawal is not a defense to conspiracy, but may be defense to liability for co-conspirators, subsequent crimes. It says here, card 11, which is the next card, is going to go into more detail on that. So let's take a look at that. Co-conspirator liability and withdrawal. So each conspirator is liable for co-conspirators' crimes that are foreseeable and committed in the furtherance of the conspiracy. Withdrawal. Common law versus MPC. What is MPC? I must have said this already and have forgotten how quickly I forget. MPC, Modern Penal Code, a comprehensive body of criminal law, not a source of law, but instead a scholarly endeavor. Common law versus Modern Penal Code. Under the common law, the defendant can only withdraw from the co-conspirator's subsequent crimes, not from the conspiracy itself. Under the modern penal code, is it modern or modal? I just said that. Modern. If the withdrawing party thwarts the conspiracy by stopping it or notifying the police, that would constitute withdrawal. Affirmative act is required. Defendant must make an affirmative act that notifies his co-conspirators that he's withdrawing. It must be timely. Defendant's withdrawal must give time for the co-conspirators to abandon the plans for the target offense. For example, defendant cannot withdraw as his co-conspirators are beginning to commit the target offense. The defendant must try to neutralize. In most states, the withdrawing party must attempt to neutralize the effect of any assistance provided to the original conspiracy. I like that. That's interesting. Solicitation. In inciting, urging, or asking another to commit a crime with the intent that they commit that said crime. The elements of solicitation: inciting, urging, or asking another to commit a crime. No affirmative response is required from the solicited party. It doesn't matter if the solicited party says no or even responds at all. With the intent that they likely commit the crime. For example, A asks B to kill A's brother, but B refuses and turns A into authorities. A is liable for solicitation. Merges with the target offense. If a solicitee agrees, it gives rise to a conspiracy, and the solicitation merges with the conspiracy. The only crime remaining is conspiracy. In the above example, B kills A's brother. A is liable for conspiracy to commit murder, but not solicitation. See card 13 coming up next about merger. Defenses: refusal by solicitee, impossibility, and withdrawal are not defenses. Generally, renunciation is not a defense. For example, not a defense that the defendant changed his mind. Merger. Under the merger doctrine, The defendant cannot be prosecuted for both an applicable inchoate offense and its completed substantive offense. For example, the defendant cannot be prosecuted for both murder and attempted murder. The attempt charge merges into the target offense. This only applies to solicitation and attempt. Murder does not apply to conspiracy. The defendant can be charged and convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and murder. Oh, okay. Battery. Battery is the unlawful application of force to another person that causes bodily injury or constitutes offensive touching. Elements. Unlawful application of force to another person. Any force or touching will suffice, however slight it is. Indirect application of force by a defendant is sufficient. For example, the defendant can be guilty of battery by causing his dog to attack the victim. That causes bodily injury. Number 2, element is that causes bodily injury or constitutes offensive touching. The touching must result in bodily harm, a bruise, or an offensive touching must be an unwanted kiss. Note, under modern statute, battery may have an aggravated counterpart, which usually arises when battery causes serious bodily injury or is carried out with the use of a weapon. So it would be aggravated battery. Okay, next card is assault. Assault is the intentional creation. Assault is the intentional creation of a victim's reasonable apprehension of imminent bodily harm. For example, an attempted assault. Assault in most states, assault can come about 2 ways. The first way is intentional creation of a victim's reasonable apprehension of imminent bodily harm. Words alone are usually insufficient. If assault involves touching, it is considered battery. Assault was an attempted battery. The defendant will be liable for assault if he attempted a battery. Specific intent crime because it involves attempt. Note, under modern statutes, assault may carry a greater penalty when a weapon is used. Rape. Common law. Unlawful carnal knowledge of a woman by a man other than her husband without effective consent. The slightest penetration is sufficient to complete the crime. Modern statutes, most states rename rape as sexual assault and make it gender neutral. Marital status is insignificant. Lack of effective consent, if exists if penetration is accomplished by force or threat or immediate bodily harm. The victim is incapable of consenting due to lack of capacity, unconsciousness, intoxication, or the victim is fraudulently caused to believe the act is not intercourse. Interesting. Note, fraud or trickery alone does not constitute rape. There must be penetration without contemporaneous consent or capacity to consent. For example, convincing someone you plan on marrying them in order to have intercourse is not rape. False imprisonment or kidnapping. False imprisonment and kidnapping are 2 separate but similar crimes. False imprisonment, the unlawful confinement of a person without their consent. Consent cannot be obtained through coercion, threat, or deception. Confinement means the victim is compelled to go or remain where she does not wish to go or remain. Kidnapping is the unlawful confinement of a person that involves either some movement of the victim or concealment of the victim in an unknown, hidden, or secret location. Note, false imprisonment can become kidnapping if the victim is moved and or concealed. Next card is murder. The unlawful killing of another human with the malice of forethought. Heard this line before. The unlawful killing of another human with malice of forethought. Malice of forethought. When defendant commits the killing with one of the following mental states or conditions. Intent to kill, number 1. Number 2, the intent to inflict great bodily injury. Number 3, depraved or malignant heart, a killing committed with reckless or indifference to an unjustifiable risk of human life. Number 4, felony murder, a killing caused during an attempt to commission of an inherently dangerous or statutorily enumerated felony. Intent is required. It equals the intent necessary to commit the underlying felony. The statutory enumerated felony equals the statute dictates that killing result from the crime constitutes felony murder. See card 19 for felony murder. That's coming up right here. Number 19, felony murder, a killing that occurs in the attempt or commission of a certain enumerated felonies. For example, a criminal statute states that a killing occurring during its commission constitutes a felony murder. For example, in the course of a conspiracy to commit a felony, a death is caused by one member of the conspiracy. All members guilty of the conspiracy may be liable for murder under the felony murder doctrine. The limits on liability for felony murder: the defendant must be guilty of the underlying felony. Valid defenses to the underlying felony are also defenses to the felony murder. The underlying felony must be independent of a killing. For example, involuntary manslaughter cannot be felony murder. The victim's death must be a foreseeable result of the felony. The victim's death must be caused before defendant reaches a place of temporary safety. Must be caused before that. Okay. Defendant is not liable for the death of a co-felon killed by police or killed by the original victim. Okay, these are limits on liability for felony murder. The victim's death must be caused before defendant reaches a place of temporary safety. Voluntary manslaughter. This is card number 20, and the last one we'll do with this one today. A killing resulting from the adequate provocation, heat of passion killing, or imperfect self-defense. An adequate provocation required elements. Provocation would cause a sudden and intense passion in an ordinary person, causing him to lose self-control. The defendant was in fact provoked. There was such insufficient time for an ordinary person to cool off between the provocation and the killing. And D, the defendant did not cool off between the provocation and killing. D kills V immediately upon finding V in bed with D's wife. Imperfect self-defense. If D murders while acting in self-defense, his criminal liability may be reduced to voluntary manslaughter if either the defendant initiated the altercation that required self-defense, or D, defendant unreasonably but honestly believed deadly force was necessary. Note, not recognized in all jurisdictions. Voluntary manslaughter. All right, that's number 20. We did 20 cards out of this pack. Not quite half, but we'll do 20 at a time. That's probably more than anybody could stand. It looks like 30 minutes long here so far. I'm going to look up Incohot, see how that's pronounced, and go through these cards. And now that I've recorded it, I can listen to it myself and maybe get this in my mind nice and firmly. So thanks for sticking with me. If you're watching this, I don't know if you want to like my page or subscribe or do any of that kind of stuff. I don't know. I'm just reading this and trying to learn this information and get it under my belt. So hopefully you'll catch me in the next 20 cards. All right, take care.